Welcome back. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Clear in the Air podcast. I'm here with the wonderful, amazing, and real Dr. Christine Saccone.
Thanks so
Christine,
much for
thank you
having
joining
me.
us.
It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Thank you. So, Christine, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I am a pharmacist by education. I went through pharmacy school. I worked in both retail and I did long-term care pharmacy. Started as a pharmacy technician when I was a teenager. Loved it. I loved the accessibility of a pharmacist to the general public. So you had like healthcare like on demand, which is important because sometimes patients get lost in the shuffle. So it's nice that patients can just walk into CVS or an independent pharmacy and they have a question about their disease state or their medication and someone's there to answer it. But in the time that I was in pharmacy school, I was always drawn to research and clinical research and just kind of the development of, medications and things for patient use. I did a internship at Merck for 2 summers where I did basic lab science. So that kind of really drew my interest into like how the drug industry works. And then on my clinical rotations, I did some activities at research sites and things like that. So I got a little bit more in depth into like how clinical research actually works. I went through, like I said, retail and kind of did the pharmacist circuit for a while, but I always had that draw to come back to clinical research. So made my way back to MedCore. I was the consultant pharmacist for the staff. Dr. Sylvia approached me with the wonderful opportunity to start the clinical research program. And long story short, now we're here. So yeah, it's been a wonderful journey. Yep.
So what inspired you then to pursue a career in clinical research?
So I've always been a science nerd. for lack of a better definition. I always kind of wanted to know how things work, specifically how the body works, and kind of what happens when things go wrong. How do we course correct? And so that's kind of my love as a pharmacist kind of came from that as well. So just kind of knowing, I've always been really good at pharmacology and kind of figuring out like how to like fine tune the system. Always kind of wanted to know the answers of how things work and how can we make things better. And so that's really where clinical research comes into medicine.
For those unfamiliar, can you clarify what a clinical trial actually involves?
Sure. So a clinical trial is basically the study of either a new drug, a new therapy, a new device, something new in medicine, essentially. And basically how do we regulate the safety as well as the efficacy of that? And what does that look like in an actual patient population? So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about medications. So it's a little bit more of what we do, but essentially, whether it's a new product that comes to market, so that's kind of more like there's early phase and late phase clinical trials. And so, they have this compound where they think it's going to be effective in whatever discipline. And so it comes to phase 1 trials, which are a small group of healthy volunteers. So essentially what they're looking at is safety, right? Is it safe in a human population? Phase 2 becomes a small subset of patients who have that condition. And they're kind of monitoring like, what's the right dose? Are we still seeing side effects? How does it apply in that disease state? Phase 3 is individuals with that condition on a much larger scale, still controlled, but still on a much larger scale, more patients, obviously more data. And then phase 4 is post-marketing. And that's kind of where our clinical studies fit in. So we're not really looking at the new therapies. We're looking at things that have already been approved, whether it's for looking at a new indication or looking at where can we fit this better into current guidelines, that sort of thing more than anything.
All right. That being said, how do you determine if a patient is a good candidate for a trial?
So a lot of it is guided from the sponsor of that clinical trial. When they're, envisioning how a study is going to go, they create guidelines for a patient that's going to enter into that study. It's collectively called the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. So patients must have all those inclusion criteria, and they must not have any of the exclusion criteria. So what it does is that kind of allows the study to be done in a controlled environment so that the data is reproducible. And they have some sort of parameters that they can guide the study for. Now, just because a patient matches the inclusion-exclusion criteria, not every study may be a good fit for that person. So we do look at each patient individually. We don't just ask patients to participate in clinical studies just because. We really try to keep it such that it has an impact on that patient and that it can give us some good data going forward and that maybe we can tailor how we practice medicine now with these new pieces of information that we get.
All right. So prior to me working here, I had no idea what clinical trials were.
Most people don't. So,
what are some common myths about clinical trials that you would like to debunk?
Sure. So, historically, clinical research and clinical trials have kind of had a bad reputation. I'm sure everybody's familiar with a lot of those incidents where patients were coerced into participating in clinical research. Things were done against their will. And so obviously we've come a long way from that. The development of the Institutional Review Board has been huge because that's the big advocate for patient safety. They really regulate and oversee a clinical trial. And so that allows us to make sure that patients are safe and protected within the environment of a clinical study. So that being said, one of the biggest things I've come across is that patients feel like the researchers and the people conducting the trial are more worried about getting the data and getting the notoriety and the publicity from completing a study, and they don't actually care about the patient. And really, at least here, that couldn't be further from the truth. Even if we approach a patient to participate in a clinical study, we're doing it with their best interest in the hopes that either they can benefit something from it, or their future generations of family or future patients can benefit from that as well. We're really big on making sure that the patients are integral in the research process. So they're made aware of everything that they're going to participate in, everything that's expected of them, what to look for as far as results, safety, efficacy, everything. They're very involved in the decision-making process for a clinical study. The other big one that I see a lot, or that I hear about a lot, is that, patients think that clinical trials are just done if you have a really severe or serious illness. You've exhausted all your treatment options. There's really nothing else left for you. And so we're going to enter you into a clinical trial. And, basically you're going to be a lab rat, and we're going to figure out what's going on and kind of just throw whatever we can at you. As I kind of alluded to before, that's really not the case. So there are those studies where those serious disease states, or disease states that don't have a lot of patient population, so there's not a lot of research that gets done there. But for example, the studies that we do studies in asthma, COPD, lung cancer screening. So all of these things have different treatment options, and sometimes we look at, this inhaler may already be on the market. Can we apply it to something else? Can we start it earlier in therapy? What are the benefits to using that product sooner, or in combination with something else? And so, we ask our current patients to participate in those studies to kind of help us determine that information, but it also benefits them as well, because a lot of times these medications are provided at no cost. So it offsets some of that for the patient. A lot of patients have told me that they just love being part of clinical research and kind of leaving their mark, which I thought was pretty cool, because, as I referenced before, I'm a big science nerd. And so that's a big one that I like to really dispel, because there's research being done in everything. And so just because we think of something as routine as asthma, there's still information that we can learn, and that's where clinical trials come in. The last one that I just want to address is a lot of times subject thinks they're just going to get a placebo or a sugar pill, that, I'm going to participate in the study, but they're not, I'm not going to receive any treatment or anything like that. Now, there are studies that do utilize placebos where you're trying to gain to look at effectiveness of whatever product versus a placebo. A lot of the studies we do are more head-to-head. So it's comparing one treatment to another. Most of these treatments, as I mentioned earlier, have been on the market for a long time. So they're proven to be safe and effective. We're doing what we call comparator studies to kind of see, is one better than the other? So patients will still receive treatment. We don't, especially for a disease state, a respiratory disease state, we wouldn't let you go untreated.
What is the biggest challenge in encouraging people to participate in the clinical trials? I
think this kind of feeds off of what we just talked about. People have a general misconception of what clinical research is. There's kind of that bad taste in your mouth when people think they're just I'm going to be a guinea pig. I've heard that. I don't want to be a lab rat. We even see things on TV when they're advertising new medications, all the different colored test tubes and everything like that. And so it's kind of hard to bring people to the realization that, we do clinical research in all different kinds of things. And, most of the research that's being done is on existing treatments and therapies. And it's really just either like fine tuning them or looking for new applications. And so I think that's kind of the biggest hurdle that I come across. Like if I present it to a patient, a lot of patients get anxiety over it because they're worried that they don't want anything negative to happen to them. I don't want to try something new that hasn't really been studied. We did see that a lot with like the COVID vaccine and the questions of like, well, how quickly can these things come to market? How safe can they really be? Patients don't realize that these products have been researched for years and years and years early on. So I think really that's probably the biggest challenge that we see.
So you've been doing this job for over a year now. Do you have any big success stories from any of the patients that you've enrolled?
So I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to meet a lot of patients. I love my job. Probably the most rewarding, I guess, experience that we've done is, so we did a couple of studies in lung cancer screening. And as you know, lung cancer, like all cancers, is a terrible illness. And while we do a lot of lung cancer screening programs within our practice itself, as pulmonologists, we're always screening former smokers and current smokers for lung cancer. The study really kind of put that into forefront. And so we were able to enroll a lot of patients. And we had several patients actually that, because of aggressive screening measures, we were actually able to detect lung cancer early, and patients were able to go through a resection, and now they're in complete remission and cured. So it's been really amazing that we've been able to do that. And I've had a lot of patients come and thank me about it. And it's just a wonderful feeling to be able to contribute that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So to piggyback off that, what do you find the most rewarding part of your job?
So without clinical research, medicine can't move forward, right? Progress won't happen, change won't happen until we put the work in. And honestly, I'm just fortunate to even have a small little role within it. Anytime that something will come to fruition as part of the hard work that I've done is just incredibly rewarding.
So one of the reasons that we wanted to do a podcast is to not only introduce, as we did on our last episode, Dr. Sylvia, and kind of how MedCore came to be, but we wanted to kind of allow all our viewers to kind of get to know who we are as individuals, aside from just a clinical research coordinator, an HR marketing director, or the owner. So I'm going to switch gears now. We're going to go to some different questions.
Q&A.
Yeah, Q&A. So if you could have dinner with one historical figure in medicine, who would it be and why?
So I'm going to have to go with Marie Curie. I just find her fascinating. Not only is she Polish, which I am as well, she was a prominent scientist in a time that women really had no business being educated in. And I just find it really exciting that she was able to do the work that she did in the fields that she did, specifically the work that she did in radioactivity. And we still have applications of that today. And I just find it fascinating that, she was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and she's just an amazing person.
Awesome.
We could talk about some Polish food recipes too.
That's on a future episode.
That's next episode.
What's a fun fact that most of your patients wouldn't know?
I love to cook and bake, specifically baking. I am mostly self-taught, and my biggest achievement has been I taught myself how to make French macarons from scratch.
Oh, how are they?
They are amazing. I have been told by many people, including our very own HR marketing, that they are wonderful. So I'm very proud of them.
As you should be.
I am. There's a lot of love that goes into them.
If you weren't in clinical research, what other career do you think you would have taken?
So I am not only a pharmacist, but I also have my biochemistry degree. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, I'm a huge science nerd. So I would probably do something in the fields of biochemistry or biochemical engineering. Again, going back to that love of research, you can't pull the girl out of science. So
fair enough. Final question. This is a tough one. It's a hard-hitting one. You work a long day. You're very busy. I can tell you're very busy making macarons.
Yes. Macarons and research. That's where it is.
What is your go-to TV show right
now? So I don't really have a lot of time to watch TV, as alluded to. I also have a young daughter, so she usually commandeers the TV, and we're usually stuck watching Bluey and things like that. But my husband and I recently just binge watched Ted Lasso. We are huge fans. I know we're late to the party, but I love Ted Lasso, love everything about him, love the Lasso way. My daughter plays soccer, so it was definitely just really cool to watch him and the inspiration that he gave to his players, and obviously the jokes along the way.
All right, well, that's a wrap for today's episode. I'd like to thank Dr. Christine Saccone for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and spending time with us. If you found this conversation helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who might benefit. You can also connect with us on our social media platforms and on our website for more updates. Links for all of those are going to be in the description. Remember, no matter where you are, we're always close to home. Until next time, take care.